Namaskar. Today we will be continuing our discussion on module 6.2 which is consumer learning. In consumer learning we have already discussed the meaning, the definition of consumer learning, the basic elements, the nature and characteristics of consumer learning. We have also discussed the approaches to learning and some of the learning theories. In fact, we have discussed the behavioral learning theories where we spoke about Pavlov and Skinner's theory of conditioning. And then we moved on to discuss the cognitive theories of learning. Today we will continue with the cognitive theories of learning and conclude with the social cognitive theory, and finally discuss the the consumer learning in the context of implications for the marketer. So, we will be concluding our session on consumer learning which is module 6.2 with this particular hour 4 which is going to be the concluding session for this particular topic. Now, while discussing the learning theories, we have discussed the cognitive theory, and today we will move on to discuss the social cognitive theories and the remaining part of the cognitive theories. Now, as if you recall, the various theories which emerged from cognitive theory, especially in reference to high and low involvement purchases, could be classified into could be better explained through three theories: the central and peripheral route to persuasion, the elaboration likelihood model, and the social judgment theory. We have already discussed the central and peripheral route to persuasion theory. Today, we will talk about the other two theories. So, let us begin with the elaboration likelihood model. Now, the elaboration likelihood model basically places itself much in line with what has been said about involvement, what has been said about high and low involvement, as well as the route to persuasion theory. If you recall, we have discussed the theory of hemispherical lateralization, where we spoke about, or the split brain theory, where we spoke about the right and the left side of the brain. The left side of the brain, which was more logical, more factual, more cognitive, and the right side of the brain, which was more intuitive, more emotional, and more artistic. So, we have spoken about the theory and how the two sides of the brain specialize in two different kinds of activities, and this also has implications in terms of the choice of the media, where the high involvement media or the print pertains more to the left side of the brain, and the low involvement media or the audiovisual medium, the TV, the FM, the radio pertains more to the right side of the brain. Now, moving beyond that, we have also discussed the central and peripheral route to persuasion, where we drew a parallel from the right and left split brain theory, and from the high and low involvement media, where we said that the central route to persuasion bases itself on cognition, rationality, logic, facts, verbal cues, and print media, and on the other hand, the peripheral route to persuasion bases itself on emotions, intuitions, affect, feelings, non-verbal cues, and relates more to the audiovisual media. So, we will continue our discussion on that, and according to this theory or the elaboration likelihood model, the level of relevance that a person attaches, or the level of involvement that a person holds, will determine which of the two routes will be more persuasive, or which will be more effective. Is it going to be the central route to persuasion or the peripheral route to persuasion? So, in cases where the consumer will attach a lot of relevance to the purchase situation, and where the purchase situation or the product is a high involvement type, the consumer will put in more cognitive effort. He will collect information, process it, comprehend it, evaluate different brands or different product alternatives, and then take a final decision. So, he essentially follows a central route to persuasion and will focus on the message content. On the other hand, where we have cases of low involvement, where the purchase situation or the product in question is a low involvement product, the consumer will follow a peripheral route to persuasion, and he will focus on the message context, on the scenery, on the music, on the jingle, on the celebrity, and so on. So if we look at the implications for a marketer, when a product is a high involvement product, it's the central route to persuasion which works, and the focus here has to be on the content of the message, the logic, the factual arguments, counter arguments, the arguments which suggest product attributes should be highly cognitive. On the other hand, when we talk about low involvement, it's a peripheral route to persuasion which works, and the focus here is on the message context, the celebrity, the spokesperson, the highly visual and graphic as well as symbolic advertisement, the background, the jingle, and the music. So this is as far as the elaboration likelihood model is concerned. How does a consumer basically elaborate upon the message that he receives, how relevant it would be in context of a high involvement or a low involvement. Now, let us come to the second theory, which is the social judgment theory. Now, the basic assumption or the basic premise of this particular theory is that it is the degree of involvement which will determine how an individual will process information and finally make evaluations or judgments about the product or service in question. So, we will take two scenarios. When faced with alternatives, people who are highly involved with an issue or an object or a situation or an event or a product will accept very few alternative options. So, such people are said to have a narrow latitude of acceptance or a high latitude or a wide latitude of rejection. So, they would be very assimilating in their nature, they will accept information, they will accept a message that is in line and in synchronization or in congruence with what they already believe in and what they already support. So, this effect is called the assimilation effect. So we see here people are highly involved in a product category or a particular situation or a product, they will accept very few alternatives, they have a wide latitude of rejection and a very narrow latitude of acceptance. They will accept such arguments, such messages which support or which reinforce or which assimilate or are in congruence with their already existing beliefs or already existing values, and they would also negate or counter such opinions that are contrasting. So, when they accept or interpret a message that is in line or in congruence with their already existing values, beliefs, attitudes, opinions, etc., we call it the assimilating effect. And on the other hand, when they try to reject anything which counters it or anything which goes against it, or anything that is not in congruence with what they believe in, we call it the contrasting effect. So, both the assimilating effect and the contrasting effect will come into play. They will like to accept what they know, what they feel is right, and they will try to reject what they do not believe in or what they feel is not the correct. Is not according to their values or their beliefs. Now, the second thing which we will speak here, the second scenario is that people who are low in involvement will accept opinions and arguments which are both for and against a product or service category or even a brand. So, they are more open, they are more open to newer ideas, newer values, newer beliefs, newer opinions, and they will possess a wide latitude of acceptance and also a wide latitude of non-commitment. In other words, to say that they will be ready to accept newer products or brands. They will also be ready to accept newer even changed or improvised brands and improvised products, and so they have a very wide latitude of acceptance. They will be ready to try out anything, any new product or any new brand. If they feel like buying, they will be ready to buy because they are open to such ideas, they are not very conservative. So, once they fear something in favor of a product or a brand, they would readily accept it and be willing to try it out and purchase it. So, they will accept opinions which are both for and against their existing knowledge or information or attitudes or values, and they will possess a wide latitude of acceptance and also wide latitude of non-commitment. So, this is what we mean to say by the social judgment theory. So, what are the implications for a marketer as far as the social judgment theory is concerned? Consumers who are highly involved with the product category, they are narrow categorizers. They will find very few brands to be acceptable. They'll tend to be more brand loyal and will tend to patronize select brands or stores, or even certain salespeople. This will generally be based on their past experiences and their resultant attitudes. And so these people would like to interpret information about these product or the brand or the store, about the salesperson, in a manner that assimilates with their previous experiences or their previous knowledge, opinion and views about a product or a brand or a store or even a salesperson. So they are likely to be brand loyal. They will find other brands unacceptable, and they will basically tend to patronize such products or brands or salespeople or stores which and interpret information with respect to them in a manner which is congruent with their existing values, beliefs, opinions, knowledge, information and so forth. On the other hand, when we talk about low involved customers, or uninvolved customers, they are broad categorizers, and they would find many brands acceptable. They will like to try out newer things. So essentially they are brand switchers. Now let us speak about the implication of this theory on of the social cognitive theory of the, let us talk about the implication of the cognitive theory for a marketer. So the cognitive theory, as we see, goes much beyond explanations on reinforcements or rewards or conditions. It deals with how people gather information, they process, they store, they retain information, and there is a retrieval. So it actually elaborates in great detail. It elaborates the learning process. It elaborates on the very dynamics of the learning process, how in terms of information gathering, processing, storage, retention and retrieval. But there are critics who have observed that learning also takes place through observation. It also takes place by observing others, remembering their behaviors and copying them or enacting them. So here in lies a gap again, where we see that neither the behavioral theories nor the cognitive theories have actually spoken about the impact that observation can have on learning. So this leads us to the next section on which is on the social cognitive theory. But before we do that, let us quickly discuss the implications of the cognitive theory for a marketer. Consumers learn via the involvement theory and related contribution in terms of central route to persuasion or peripheral route to persuasion, the elaboration likelihood model and the social judgment theory, and information gathering, processing, memory, retention and retrieval. All of these have a role to play in the learning process. As far as the overall contribution of cognitive theories to marketing is concerned, it really greatly contributes to the study of consumer behavior. It focuses on gathering and processing of information, storage in the memory in the various storage houses, whether it is the sensory store or the short term store or the long term store, going through a process of attention and rehearsal, elaboration, so forth. So, and the final, it leads actually to the storage of information in the long term memory to be retrieved later on. So, consumers store information and retrieve it later as and when they need it. It is noteworthy that they tend to remember such information about products and services or about brands which they find to be relevant or which they find to be familiar with. Retrieval of information about product or services or about brands is also assisted by cues which may be self-generated or and which may be self-generated and internal, or they may be external in the form of images, sounds, shapes, smells, cues, other cues, etc. So, if we go further, the involvement theory and the related contribution in terms of the route to persuasion, elaboration likelihood model and the social judgment theory also provide insight with respect to high and low involvement media. if a person resorts to collecting information, processing it and storing it, and even retrieving it for a purchased product, then he is said to be high on involvement. If not, he is regarded as low on involvement. For low involvement purchases, information or marketing communication through TV is the right media. Consumers learn by repetition, and that is how a message is repeated again and again on TV. On the other hand, in the case of high involvement purchases, the print media is the right choice while selecting while making a decision with respect to the media. Now, if we study or if we go back or recall the two theories, behavioral learning theories or the cognitive learning theories, what the gap essentially, as I just said a few minutes ago, lies in the very fact that both behavioral theories as well as the cognitive theories fail to give any mention, may fail to make any mention of the role that observation plays in the learning process. People learn by observation, people learn by modeling, people learn by role playing. Many of us act out certain kinds of behaviors which we see other people performing. Many of us buy certain products and services or brands because we see other people buying them. So, herein lies the role of learning, herein lies the role of observation in the learning process. So, this is what leads to the third set of theories which can be which have been proposed, which are referred to as the social cognitive learning. So, we will now talk about the social cognitive learning, and as we will see here, we will be talking about how people learn through experience, through observation and through imitation. So, the social learning theory, however, combines both the behaviorist and the cognitive approaches and focuses on the interactive nature of cognition, behavior and environmental determinants. So, here the environmental determinants are basically going to be more closely related and spoken of with respect to the with respect to the learning process. So, according to the social learning theory, people learn by observation, people learn by imitation and people learn by direct experience. Now, the process by which an individual learns or a person learns by observing other people behave and learning from the resultant experiences has been referred to as modeling or vicarious learning. So, it is seen that people learn by observing others, also giving notice or giving note to the reinforcement that follows it. So, people learn by observing the behavior of others and also looking at the resultant experiences. This is where we can link the social cognitive theory with the behavioral theories. People learn and they observe, remember the experience, remember the act of performance, retain it and act it out or motor reproduce it. So, they remember the act of performance having performed by somebody and they again remember and recall and perform the same act of behavior again. So, in this way we can relate the social cognitive theory to cognitive theory. So, if you see the social cognitive theory actually blends together both cognitive theory and behavioral theory. When we look at the the repetition or the act of reinforcement received following an act of behavior, we can link this theory with behavioral theories. On the other hand, when we pick up in observation, we point out at an observation, remember the act of behavior and perform it, and also remember the reinforcement that follows it, and at a point of time we copy this behavior or we repeat this act of behavior. So, it is here where it is not only attention towards the behavior, but also retention and motor reproduction. So, it is here which the cognitive theory also has a role to play. So, as we said, both the theories, cognitive and social cognitive, cognitive and behavioral can be seen in as to amalgamate together and can be related together to the social cognitive theory. So, the process by which an individual learns by observing others and also looking at the resultant consequences is called vicarious learning or observational learning or modeling. A major proponent or a major contributor to this school of thought or this field of social cognitive learning was made by a person by the name of Albert Bandura, who emphasized the role played by models, and he said it is these models who are central to central to the process of learning. It is these models which actually are central to social learning. Now, when we discuss the social cognitive theory, we will be discussing it in two forms. We will be talking about the social learning theory and we will be talking about the social cognitive theory. So, let us first discuss the social learning theory. Now, according to the social learning theorists, 4 processes take place or come into play for social cognitive learning to take place. These are attention, retention, motor reproduction and reinforcement. So, a person first pays attention to an act of behavior and observes a model play out an act. Second, he remembers the model's action, which is he retains it in his memory. So, he remembers the model's action. Thereafter, he enacts the same behavior, which we call as motor reproduction, and depending upon the reinforcement that he receives, whether positive or negative, he would repeat the behavior and thereby learning would take place. So, in case his act of performance is followed by a positive reinforcement, he would repeat the modeled behavior and learning is said to have taken place. So, if we look at this, a person becomes attentive to an act of behavior, he remembers it, stores it in his memory, retains it. Further, he acts it out or motor reproduces it, and based on the kind of reinforcement that he receives, he would tend to repeat that act in future and learning would take place. In case the reinforcement he receives is positive, he will repeat the act of behavior. In case it is negative, he will not repeat the act of behavior, and in either cases learning will said to have been taking place. So, this is what we mean by the social learning theory. Now, let us come to the social cognitive theory. Now, the social cognitive theory basically focuses on the self-regulatory processes that have a role to play in learning, and here we will talk about modeling and self-efficacy. So, let us first talk about modeling and then we will go in detail with respect to self-efficacy. Now, modeling, as I just told you, is also called vicarious learning, that is trying to observe a person and emulate his behavior. We call it vicarious learning. The chief contributors or the chief proponents to the theory of modeling was Miller and Dollard. Albert Bandura also had a great role to play, and he also researched a great deal with respect to modeling. So, contributions to this particular theory have been made by Miller and Dollard as well as Bandura, and they said that learning takes place through observation with 4 interrelated processes: attention, retention, motor reproduction and reinforcement. Now, modeling can assume different kinds of forms. We can speak of modeling to manifest in 4 different types. We have the modeling effect, the eliciting effect, the disinhibitory effect and the inhibitory effect. So, let us discuss what each one of these is. To start with modeling effect, when a person duplicates the behavior of another person, we say it is called the modeling effect. So, what he does here is he duplicates the behavior after seeing somebody else perform it. So, we call it the modeling effect. A person duplicates a behavior after seeing someone else perform it. Eliciting effect, when a person behaves similar to the model but does not directly copy them. So, the difference here between modeling and eliciting effect is that in modeling effect he will directly copy them, but in the case of eliciting effect he will act out instances or acts of behavior which will be similar to the model. They will not essentially be copied, but they will be similar. The disinhibitory effect, when a person refrains from acting out a certain kind of a behavior, we call it the disinhibitory effect. Okay. What happens is the person realizes that the act of behavior has been followed by a negative consequence or an undesirable consequence. So, he decides not to perform such acts of behavior. We call it the disinhibitory effect. Let us now discuss the first, which is modeling. Modeling has also been referred to as vicarious learning. We just mentioned a few minutes ago that when people watch other people behave and try to copy their behavior based on the act of behavior as well as the resultant consequence, we call it vicarious learning, or we call it modeling. Now, the chief proponents of the modeling theory were Millard and Dollard. Also, Albert Bandura also contributed a great deal to the theory of modeling, and they said that learning basically takes place through observation and 4 interrelated processes of attention, retention, motor reproduction and reinforcement. Now, when modeling basically can assume 4 different forms. We can speak of the modeling effect, the eliciting effect, the disinhibitory effect and the inhibitory effect. So, let us talk about these 4 forms which modeling can take. The first is modeling effect. When a person observes somebody performing a particular act of behavior and repeats it, we call it the modeling effect. So, a person duplicates a behavior after having seen a person perform a particular act. Eliciting effect. When a person acts similarly to a model, we call it the eliciting effect. The difference between modeling and eliciting is that in modeling he directly copies the act of behavior, but in the eliciting effect he tries to be similar, he tries to behave similar to the model, but does not copy him. The third is the disinhibitory effect. When a person refrains from performing a particular act of behavior, we call it the disinhibitory effect. Why does this happen? This happens because if a person observes a model perform an act and that act does not bring any negative consequence, the person would begin to behave in a similar manner. This is because he realizes that the particular act does not bring with it any negative consequences. So, we call it the disinhibitory effect. And finally, we have the inhibitory effect. When a person refrains from performing an act of behavior because he sees a model being punished for engaging in that act of behavior, or when he says somebody is being negatively reinforced for performing that act of behavior, we call it the inhibitory effect. Now, for observation or for vicarious learning to be effective, the following can be helpful. 1, the models. Okay. The models should be extremely credible, they should be reputed, they should be trustworthy, they should hold expertise in a particular field, they should also be physically attractive, good looking, beautiful and be very successful. They should hold for themselves a high reputation, be trustworthy and very, very credible. So, the more a model has such of these characteristics, the more likely that people will copy him, will emulate him and learning will take place. The second element which can prove to be helpful in vicarious or observational learning is the target audience or the consumer characteristics or the consumer personality traits. So, consumers should be receptive, they should be low on dogmatism, they should be other directed, they should be or socially directed and they should be low on self esteem. So, with these characteristics or with these personality traits having present in the target segment, learning will be effective. So, while talking of social cognitive learning, we have spoken about the social learning theory and the social cognitive theory. So, while discussing social cognitive theory, we have just discussed modeling. Now, let us go to the second which is self-efficacy. Now, self-efficacy is the ability of a person to deal with situations and problems as and when they realize they have a problem or as when such problems arise. Bandura has defined it the ability of a person to succeed in problematic situations or in situations where there is a lot of tension or there is a lot of anxiety. So, people who are high on self-efficacy behave in a better manner than people who are low on self-efficacy. They look at people with high on self-efficacy look at problems with greater courage. They are confident by nature and they look at problems as within their own capacities. They look at problems as being within their own control. So, people who are high on self-efficacy would be able to act out things in a much better manner than people who are low on self-efficacy. So, according to theorists, people on high efficacy tend to be good learners, and learning is much faster for people who are high on self-efficacy than for people who are on low self-efficacy. As we just said, self-efficacy implies a person's ability to cope up with problems, to cope up with problematic situations as and when they when they arise. And people who have such abilities feel that things are within their control and they will be able to manage the environment around them. They are much more confident about themselves, about their capacities and about their capabilities to solve with such problems. They are quick at learning, and they are much better learners than people who are low on self-efficacy. Now, let us come to an assessment of this theory and its implications for a marketer. So, the theory of social cognition, which is both social cognitive theory and social learning theory, both of them combine the behaviorist and cognitive theories of learning, and they basically focus on the role that is played by experience, observation and modeling on the process of learning. Marketers, how this can be relevant for a marketer is that marketers can impact consumers' ability to learn by illustrating product usage, by models and the resultant outcomes, which in most cases should be favorable. So, marketers could depict what happens when certain brands are used and what happens when certain brands are not used. So, by showing the benefits of usage of a brand, or by showing the disadvantages or of not using the brand, a marketer can basically help people realize, and they can use models to basically illustrate product usage and the result outcome. So, for observational or vicarious learning to be effective, models should be very trustworthy, they should be credible, they should be experts, they should hold some reputation of themselves, they should be successful, the target audience should be receptive, low on dogmatism and low on self-esteem. People high on self-efficacy tend to be good learners, and learning is much faster, much long lasting. Also, providing demonstrations and usage of a product can aid the learning process. The overall contribution to the theory of marketing, the social cognitive theories go beyond behavioral and cognitive theories. They show how experience, observation and modeling can play a big role in the process of learning. Here, in terms of marketing, we would like to state that the marketers often make a lot of attempts on giving product demonstrations, or during purchase and even post purchase. There are the dealer often, especially with reference to electronic goods, the dealers make sure that the product is brought home and is installed, and a salesperson or a technician from the company comes and gives a demo of the same. So, pre-purchase there is a demo, post-purchase also there is a demo. So, this demo or this demonstration is actually a way of trying to make the consumer learn about the usage of the product, about the act of attention, retention, motor reproduction and reinforcement. So, if a marketer wants to sell his product, it is very important for him to basically show how less complicated or less complex the usage is. So, if he gives a demonstration of the same in this shop, he tries to make the consumer familiar about the product, and once the product is sold, and the technician comes home and gives a demo of the same for usage, things become easier for a consumer. The technician will show how the product is to be dealt with, what is the mechanism, how it is to be operated, the switch button, the off button, the power buttons, the menu, everything is clearly there on the pad and on the keypad, and once he shows that to our consumer, the consumers pay attention to it, they learn it, and then they try to repeat this behavior, and if they are successfully able to do so, we say reinforcement has taken place and learning has actually occurred. So, that is how we say that these learning theories could be relevant for a marketer. Now, then let us come to consumer learning and the implications for a marketer. So, we will now conclude the role played by the three theories, whether it is the behavioral theory or the cognitive theory and the social cognitive theory. How are these theories relevant to a marketer? We shall be discussing this, and let us begin with the classical conditioning theory. So, as you all remember and you would know, we spoke about the principles of repetition, stimulus generalization and stimulus discrimination. We will start with repetition. Repetition helps association between an unconditioned stimulus and a conditioned stimulus in respect to a pairing between the two. Signs, colors, logos, jingles, symbols, music, all of them facilitate learning, and any and all form of repetition aids retention and thereby slows down the process of forgetting. That is the reason why advertisements are played and repeated either in print or in audiovisual media. However, too much of repetition can lead to satiation, and it can lead to advertisement wear out, where marketers would then have to go for substantive variation and cosmetic variation. Coming to stimulus generalization on the part of the marketers could help, on the part of the consumers could help marketers of Me Too products. Apart from Me Too marketers, both market challengers and market followers capitalize on stimulus generalization, and they try to take advantage of the market leader's position by coming up with similar packages or similar advertisements, so that and even may use similar celebrities or models in their advertisement. So, also as far as a marketer is concerned, the marketer may encourage generalization of new product lines in the form of product line extensions, brand extensions, family branding and licensing, all of which will help in the generalization process and thereby help in consumer learning. Marketers try to differentiate themselves through stimulus discrimination. Very often they use a unique selling proposition to basically show how different they are, how unique they are from their competitors. In case there is no USP, he tries to differentiate by focusing on a feature or an attribute that is important or relevant. Consumers respond to learning via classical conditioning when the level of risk is low, when products are low on differentiation and the products are routine purchases, convenience goods and impulse items. Coming to the second behavioral theory, which is the operant or the instrumental conditioning theory, marketers can make use of instrumental conditioning when they reward a consumer for favoring a particular brand, or they depict how a particular brand can bring the desired outcome or a favorable outcome. Marketers need to understand the role played by trial and error. Consumers very majorly learn by trial and error. So, marketers should try to ensure consumers try out their products, especially the newly launched products, either through sales promotion or through free samples, or even through, for certain products like cars or vehicles, even through test runs or any kind of experiential handling. Some purchases are more rewarding than others, they lead to favorable outcomes. On the other hand, some lead to unfavorable outcomes. Satisfaction or dissatisfaction with the product, with the brand and with the purchase outcome will lead to will have an impact on brand loyalty, and it will affect the habit paradigm. So, satisfaction and dissatisfaction with the product or a brand acts as a reinforcement strategy and will have an impact on the development of brand loyalty or the habit paradigm. Rewards likely increase the likelihood that a behavior will be repeated. Okay. Marketer can encourage consumers to buy his brands through positive reinforcement, that is, reward the consumer if he buys or if he uses their product. So, what marketers should also understand that whatever is used as a reward must be attractive, it must hold value for the customer. So, the value here or the reward may not only relate to product satisfaction, but also other services or facilities like rebates, discounts, loyalty points, etc. Consumer will patronize a brand or a store if he feels that his purchase decision is satisfying and rewarding, and the marketer can also try and teach the consumers about the negative consequences of not using a brand or using a a competitor's brand in terms of the problems that can arise if his brand is not used. Heavily used reinforcements lose charm, they lead to a satiation effect. So, rewards should not be on a regular basis, they should be occasional, and consumers respond to learning via instrument conditioning when trial can be attempted before purchase. Purchases are linked to desirable effective experiences, and there is high involvement and high cognitive activity. So, this is how the classical theory and the operant theory or the behavioral theories of learning could hold relevance for a marketer. Now, let us discuss how the cognitive theory of learning can have can help marketers redesign their strategies. Marketers should understand that consumers make use of creativity while decision making. They make use of creativity, insight, and information. A lot of information which they search is internal. It is internal to them, and they go back their memory to retrieve this information. Some of the information is also searched externally, and all of this information especially in terms of external search goes and gets added up in his memory. It modifies or changes or adds up to the existing database, and the various information gets unified as a whole to be retrieved later on. Consumers should be exposed to information about products and services, about brands. Marketers must also educate them about the various changes that have been made in the attributes or in the features or benefits or in comparison with other brands. In terms of consumer behavior, any kind of learning, any kind of extensive problem solving is basically a part of cognitive learning. Consumers collect information, retrieve it later on. Factors that affect storage, retention and retrieval are physiological factors, familiarity and relevance of the information, the situation, the ambience, the atmosphere, the moods, emotions, etc. Retrieval of information is assisted by cues, which may be either self-generated or may be external in the form of images, sounds, music, shapes, colors, smells. Marketing strategies can be used to create a feeling of nostalgia and effect instant recall. Information is stored in one's memory either episodically or semantically. Also visually, visual always gains over semantics. Information that is spread through images, pictures and audios is much easily stored and retrieved than information that is written or is through reading, speaking and writing. The involvement theory, non-verbal and pictorial cues trigger right brain processing. So, when involvement is low, people passively process and store non-verbal pictorial information. TV is regarded as a low involvement media. Even TV watching of TV is regarded as a right brain activity. On the other hand, verbal and cognitive use trigger left brain processing. When involvement is high, people passively process and store verbal and written information. Print media is regarded as a high involvement media. If people resort to information during a purchase, they are said to be high on involvement. So, for high involvement purchases and low involvement purchases, the choice of media strategy will be impacted. For low involvement media, marketing communication through TV is the right media. On the other hand, for high involvement media, for high involvement purchases, the print media is more relevant, it is more important. The route to persuasion theory, the central route to persuasion works in the case of high involvement situations, and peripheral route to persuasion works in the case of low involvement purchases. Central route bases itself on facts, logic, rationality. Print media, verbal cues. Peripheral route on the other hand bases itself on feelings, affect, emotions, intuition, non-verbal cues and audio visual media. So, for high involvement products and purchase situations, the marketer should basically choose the print media, and he should focus centrally on providing information about the product, about the attributes, about the benefits, comparative advantage, etc. So, it is a central route to persuasion with a focus on the message content, essentially cognitive. On the other hand, for low involvement products and purchase situations, the marketer should use the audiovisual media, focus on the peripheral cues, the background music, colors, or the spokesperson or the celebrity. It is the peripheral route to persuasion where the focus is on the message context, and it is essentially emotions, intuition, fun, fantasy and the like. Coming to the elaboration likelihood model, as per this particular model, a person's high or low level of involvement will determine which route of persuasion will be more effective. In cases of high involvement, where a consumer would put in more cognitive effort, he will be following the central route to persuasion, and in the case of and it focus on the message. On the other hand, in case of low involvement, he would follow a peripheral route to persuasion, and the message context, the relevance will be more relevant, the background music, jingle, color, etc. becomes more relevant. Coming to the social judgment theory, the degree of importance that a person attaches to a purchase will determine how he processes information. We have consumers who are highly involved in a product category. They will be essentially narrow categorizers. They will find very few brands acceptable, and they will try to patronize certain brands, certain stores. They would like to interpret any kind of information which supports their already existing views, opinions, values, knowledge, and so it will be a process of assimilation. On the other hand, we have low involvement customers who will be who are wide categorizers. They are broad categorizers. They will find many brands acceptable, and they are essentially brand switchers. Coming to the third theory, which is the social cognitive learning theory. Taking a cue from cognitive theories, of social cognitive theories, marketers can impact learning by showing what happens when certain products are used. For example, if you use an anti-wrinkle cream by Garnier, you will basically be benefited. So what happens to a middle-aged when she uses an anti-wrinkle cream? So you depict what happens when your brand is used. The consumer marketers can also impact consumers' ability by demonstrating the usage or the operation of a product. For example, a laptop or a microwave, and person would be motivated to act out behavior if he finds that the consequence is something which is favorable, and if he receives positive reinforcement. For observation or vicarious learning to be effective, the model should be trustworthy, they should be credible, they should be physically attractive, good looking, hold some level of repute and expertise. The target audience should be receptive, they should be other directed, socially directed, low on self esteem. People who are high on self efficacy are better learners, they are faster learners, and this is in contrast to people who are low on self efficacy. So, this brings us to this brings us to an end of our discussion on consumer learning and the implications for the marketer. Let us now come to the references for further reading. Arcel 1992 Consumer Behavior and Marketing Action 4th edition, Loudon and Della Bitta Consumer Behavior 4th edition 2002 Tata McGraw-Hill, Kotler and Keller Marketing Management 13th edition 2009 Pearson, Peter and Olson Consumer Behavior and Marketing Strategy 7th edition 2005 McGraw-Hill, Schiffman and Kanu Consumer Behavior 8th edition 2004 Prentice Hall, and Wells and Prensky Consumer Behavior 1996 John Wiley and Sons. Let us go in to see some frequently asked questions. Question number 1, discuss the theory of social cognitive learning. So, you will talk about the social cognitive learning and deal upon social learning theory and social cognitive theory. You will talk about the 4 sub processes of attention, retention, motor reproduction and reinforcement. You will also talk about the modeling effect, the eliciting effect, the disinhibitory effect and the inhibitory effect. Question number 2, draw from the following implications for the marketer. So, you will talk about classical conditioning theory, the repetition, stimulus generalization and stimulus discrimination. Cognitive learning theory, you will talk about the high involvement and the low involvement, and the central route to persuasion theory, the elaboration likelihood model and the social judgment model, and finally, the elaboration likelihood model, how you will relate it to low and high involvement. Let us have a quiz now. Section A, true and false. People who are high on self-efficacy are found to be high on involvement. Is this true or is this false? Well, this is a true statement. Section B, fill in the blanks. 1. According to the dash theory, people learn through direct experience, observation and imitation. So, it is according to the social learning theory, people learn through direct experience, observation and imitation. Question number 2, the process by which an individual learns by observing the behavior of others and the resultant consequences is referred to as dash learning. So, it is referred to as modeling or vicarious learning. Question number 3, dash implies the ability within a person to cope up with situations and problems as they arise. So, the answer to this is self-efficacy. Self-efficacy implies the ability within a person to cope up with situations and problems as they arise. Section C, multiple choice questions. Many a times a person refrains from performing an act of behavior after he watches a model do so. This is called the dash effect. So, this is called the modeling effect, inhibitory effect, disinhibitory effect or eliciting effect. So, this is called the disinhibitory effect. Short answers. Question number 1, name the 4 processes that come into play for social cognitive learning to take place. So, the 4 processes are attention, retention, motor reproduction and reinforcement. 2, modeling could assume a variety of forms, name them. The 4 forms that modeling can assume is modeling effect, eliciting effect, modeling effect, eliciting effect, disinhibitory effect and inhibitory effect. With this, we come to a conclusion of our discussion on on topic 6, module 6.2 consumer learning. We have completed our discussion on the topic with implications for the marketers and its relevance in the context of consumer behavior. We shall continue with the subject in the next session, and we shall be discussing module 6.3, which speaks about the personality, self-concept and self-image. I hope you have benefited from this session. Thank you.